Hi, I'm Geoff Matthews, and for those of you who don't know me, for the better part of the last decade, I haven't held back when challenging the aluminium industry to do more when it comes to decarbonisation and environmental sustainability. Unfortunately, while we have some glimmers of hope popping up around the world, our trajectory has remained unchanged over the past 20 years. Each year we continue to produce more and more CO2, break records every year. Professor Halvor Kavande's observation that we're actually producers of CO2 with aluminium as a byproduct is fundamentally correct. When you produce multiple tonnes of CO2 per 1 tonne of end product, this is undeniable. In my role as event director and partner of Sustainable Industrial Manufacturing Asia Pacific and host of the broadcast show SIM-PAC Live, I have a unique view across the entire spectrum of industrial manufacturing. And the more I get immersed in sustainability across this whole sector, the more I worry about aluminium industry's incredibly slow efforts to decarbonise. A new term has emerged in the environmental field of endeavour, and I think it's absolutely applicable to aluminium production. The term is predatory delay. The problem with predatory delay is that each year we delay, we make the job for future generations that much more difficult. And while I have termed aluminium the beautiful metal for its recyclability, I'm not one of those who thinks the material can never be replaced if we don't start to move at a really rapid pace towards decarbonisation. I once, sensationally perhaps, said that if we don't change, aluminium will become a toxic material by 2050. Make no mistake, there will be no social licence to operate producing that much CO2 in 2050. There will also be no social licence in the short to medium terms to do nothing and expect the world owes you a favour. Smelters relying on government bailouts or special fixed firm pricing will be a thing of the past, especially in modern renewable grids that will be variable in their production. These predatory delay tactics will be exposed for what they are eventually. The chickens will come home to roost. The predatory delay tactic is obvious when you examine the credibility gap in what the industry bodies are saying and the delivery reality. I know my comments will be confronting for some, and they need to be. This week, while working on the H2 Hydrogen Summit, I had the pleasure of writing an article based off an interview with Sir Jonathan Porritt. In it, he points out that in July 2023 was the hottest month in human history. He says that not only has the climate's reached a tipping point, but we have reached a tipping point in terms of our realisation about how fast things are moving in the natural world. He says the question for all of us is, are things moving at an equivalent speed in society? His contention is that we have to up our game dramatically in order to match the speed in which things are changing in the natural world. I can tell you that the oceans are warming and the poles are melting and our climate is becoming more volatile, way faster than any changes we're making to the way we produce aluminium globally. Sir Jonathan says he's become more and more intolerant of people who love banging on about 2050 targets. He says 2050 targets are the political equivalent to being on antidepressants. It sort of means you don't really have to focus on what needs to happen right now. He too also uses the term predatory delay for this behaviour. So let's start out at our industry's ultimate predatory delay tactic, the pathway to 2050. Now I'm guilty of actually starting this ball rolling, but not for delay tactics. In 2020, Dr. Mark Doreen, Dr. Nick Dupree and myself published the first aluminium pathway to zero carbon 2050. We did it really as a wake-up call to the industry to say, good luck people, the clock is ticking. In 2001, the IAI published their Global Aluminium Decarbonisation Pathway. And there have been other agencies like Bloomberg and Mission Possible Partnership as well. both of which interviewed us extensively when forming their own pathways, by the way. Essentially, all of the starting points are pretty similar. Are you a few thousand tonnes of CO2 here or there? Makes no difference. It's all bad. And all had the same three areas to focus on: electricity decarbonisation, direct emissions, and reduction in recycling, and resource efficiency along that. However, the projected annual growth rates varied, as well as when we reached peak aluminium emissions. Now, and these make a big difference. The IAI, however, have a much lower growth rate than any other growth rate we could find. When we published our pathway to zero carbon in 2050, we used the CR group figure of 3.8% CAGR. As it was the middle of the road independent forecasts. The CR group now predict this is going to be 4.3. The growth rate's gone up, while the IAI are currently talking about 2%, 2.2%. Why this is important? Well, the end figure of what is needed in 2050 is a difference of around 150 million tonnes per annum. And that's a lot of CO2 hidden in these underestimated IAI growth projections. Now, I've seen projections that the amount of aluminium used annually, just in solar panels alone, is predicted to grow by 3,000% by 2050. So while the pace of the energy transition, as it speeds up, I struggle to see 2.2% growth figure, and I'm not the only one. I do hope, however, that the underestimating is not a function of hiding emissions. Let's move on to peak emissions. The IEA show peak emissions declining along with the predicted decarbonisation of our energy systems. And I currently see no end to peak emissions. And because I see AL smelting keeping coal and gas alive long after every other sector of the economy has weaned themselves off constant on-demand power use. I'll come back to this point as it's really the central issue. But before I do, I want to make it clear that the real issue I have with the IAA is not the technical contents, but the greenwashing language and the predatory delay position that comes with it. The IAI say, and I quote, that they are exploring realistic and credible technological pathways for 2050 sector-wide greenhouse gas emission reduction in line with the Energy Agency scenarios. Now, hang on a minute. The IEA doesn't believe aluminium production is on track. Quite the opposite, actually. It moved from a yellow to a red after the IEA pathway came out. So the IEA are so far away from credible and realistic pathways, they don't even know people are laughing at them. Let's look first at direct process emissions. The main plan of the IAI pathway is ELYSIS, which, even if it was deployable technology today, we would need to deploy it in every smelter in the world by 2050. And we haven't even one in the planning yet, not even a potline. In case you missed it, Rio announced recently its most significant investment in the aluminium business for more than a decade, a US $1.1 billion investment expanding its aluminium smelter in Quebec. Wait for it. The investment will involve modernising the AP60 pots. No mention of ELYSIS. Gone. Nada. Nothing. Nine. So the only planned expansion we have, not due until 2026 by the way, is in carbon anodes. Seriously, if there is a person in the world who thinks we can rebuild all of the current smelting capacity and build at least 100% more capacity, all with ELYSIS, in the next 27 years, please step forward. Furthermore, the only alternative to eliminate process emissions is the use of CCUS, carbon capture. Unfortunately, this is another mountain to climb. We would have to deploy CCUS equipment on all smelters in the world by 2050. CCUS, by the way, is to me a last resort option. but it's currently the only way to mitigate direct process emissions, and we need to have started long before now. As far as I know, no one's even started down this pathway for smelters yet, and we don't even have, as far as I know, a trial in place or planned. So again, step forward the person who believes we can deploy this technology in every smelter in the world by 2050 and be extracting millions of tonnes of CO2 each year out of pot rooms when we haven't even started yet and we have no idea of the cost. Let's move on to recycling and resource efficiency. Now, this is an area where I do have more faith that we can make some real inroads and meaningful reductions. But, and this is a big but, not until we face the uncomfortable truth and stop the green labelling of what's currently an unsustainable practice. Green labelling describes a marketing tactic that implies a product is green or sustainable, but is a misleading, mislabeled claim. Now, an admission here. Until very recently, I have been as guilty as the rest of us, quoting that aluminium can be infinitely recycled with just 5% of the energy originally required. I've bought into the mantra, or the lie if you really want to be honest about it. I'll give you an example. Australians use 6 billion cans a year. We even have a 10 cents a can refund scheme. The general public have bought into the mantra that aluminium cans are infinitely recyclable. But hang on, when I Googled how much of this is recycled in Australia, I was shocked to the core that essentially no aluminium scrap is recycled in Australia, less than 5%. It's exported in ships to Indonesia and Korea, where coal-fired power stations are used to remelt it. Let me be clear here. There is no such thing as infinitely recycling something when you put it in a ship and send it offshore to be remelted with fossil fuels. There is nothing infinite about that. We need to stop saying it. In the UK, that can figure is over 15 billion a year, with zero being recycled in the United States, in the United Kingdom. Diageo, a British beverage company, plans to fund and establish a consortium for advanced alloys who will create a circular economy for aluminium in the UK. Great stuff. But I want to quote something important here from Diageo in their announcement. And I'll quote, "Currently, to recycle and remake cans in the UK is reliant on an energy-intensive, unsustainable supply chain that is based on exporting and importing of aluminium." Just in case you missed that, I'll repeat it. An energy-intensive, unsustainable supply chain. Thank you, Diageo, for your honesty and for your investment, by the way. The consortium will build a plant to recycle scrap aluminium and produce rolled aluminium sheet in a closed loop. The plant will produce more than enough for the over 400 million cans they use, and all Guinness cans will be made with recycled material. Great stuff. So let's all stop green labelling it. Unless you have an end-of-life solution that doesn't include shipping it around different countries and using fossil fuels to remelt it, it's not infinitely recyclable. What we should be saying instead is to quote Professor Geoff Matthews, who says, "Aluminium has the potential to be zero carbon, but the entire supply chain needs to see dramatic reduction in emissions." So let's gang together, let's create sustainable supply chains, but until then, tell it like it is. Aluminium has the potential to be zero carbon, because perpetrating the lie doesn't actually get us anywhere. My answer to the problem of Australia and the UK exporting, by the way, is that the government simply need to ban it. Same with the EU. Aluminium scrap needs to be treated as a critical resource and not allowed to be exported. Now, in Australia, we've got a good precedent. They banned the export of lead-acid batteries a few years ago. And now a vibrant recycling community has emerged with 95% of all lead-acid batteries being recycled in Australia, with 98% of the battery being recycled. Really great stuff. And the same needs to happen with aluminium scrap. If you ban its export, a recycling industry will crop up. Some more good news, okay? Norsk Hydro produced the world's first batch of carbon-free aluminium. It was recycled aluminium using hydrogen fuel production in June this year. Green hydrogen replaced natural gas as a fuel for the recycling of aluminium during the test, and the test was carried out at a cast house in Hydro's extrusion plant in Navarra, Spain. Now, some may ask, what about NOx emissions? But let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they managed to minimise or eliminate those as well. It is technically possible. But let us understand the magnitude of this. And I quote, by removing the carbon emissions from the energy source, we will be able to produce carbon-free aluminium from recycled post-consumer scrap for the very first time. And here is the mountain to climb. That is just the first test batch. Go another few, with another few 100 million tonnes to go. Has the IEA got a realistic schedule at how we're going to convert all of the planet's aluminium scrap remelt to zero carbon in the next 27 years, let alone account for the huge growth in recycling that we're needed to actually bring the total CO2 content down of aluminium produced in the world? Again, the clock is ticking. And lastly, let's get to the main problem as I see it. Electricity decarbonisation. So let's look through the realistic and credible pathway lens. Let's put a realistic and credible pathway lens on electricity decarbonisation. Deep in the 500 odd pages of this year's IEA Energy Outlook, Outlook 22, published 23, there is a really critical statement when it comes to electricity decarbonisation in industry. The IEA said we need to decouple our industrial processes from demand in the grid. Let me repeat that because it's really critical. We need to decouple our industrial processes from demand in the grid. I want to show you a slide here, a photo that was published last week of an EV charging station in South Australia. This photo sums up the problem perfectly. Daytime, when there's lots of solar put in the power system, 40 cents a kilowatt hour. After 3 p.m. it doubles to 80 cents. Those of you who attended the Future Aluminium Forum in Warsaw 2019 may remember I gave a speech on the future of electricity. This is exactly what I was predicting back then. And this is only the beginning. High penetration of renewables would inevitably mean we see times where electricity is at low or no cost, and at other times when it's eye-wateringly expensive. The price of electricity at these times will be directly related to the cost of firming in the power system at the time. Currently, most markets, this is tied to the cost of gas. But as we finish with fossil fuels, none of the firming options look cheap. So this is the environment which AL smelters need to learn to operate in. And there's no turning back. And guess what? We're already late to the party. It started in earnest a half a decade ago when we were in full denial mode. The problem is no one would comprehend a world, back then, no one would comprehend a world without fossil fuels. And now we're starting to see the emergence of something that I think is far more sinister than even predatory delay. We're becoming firmly stuck in a mindset of green shifting. That is to shift the blame to someone else. So while everyone else recognises the price of electricity will be dictated by demand in the grid, and with renewable energy sources going to dominate our power systems, the Australian Aluminium Council comes out swinging, and I quote, smelters have the opportunity to source firm renewable electricity from on and off grid sources. Hang on. Who's offering firmed renewable energy? Where are they going to get this from? Recently, the smelter in New South Wales asked for interest in renewable energy suppliers to supply firmed renewable electricity. At a cheap cost, of course. It's not surprising that no one came forward. And the whole exercise, in my opinion, was clearly set up to green shift the blame from themselves, the aluminium smelters, to renewable energy providers by asking the impossible just so they could say, see, the market can't supply what we need. And this shouldn't be surprising, however. I visited Tomago a few years ago, and the then CFO took me into the boardroom and showed me a huge lump of coal on the middle of the board table. And he said to me, that's there to show the politicians what an aluminium smelter has to run off. It's clear where the mindset is at. And Tomago has also publicly made fun at that a big battery could only supply them for 15 minutes. My answer to Tomago is be your own big battery, Tomago. You could modulate energy up and down 200 megawatts indefinitely with modulation technology. You have no excuse. You just don't want to shift from your 50-year-old business as usual paradigm. And while we're on the subject of statements from the Australian Aluminium Council, things get worse. And I would say it tops off all the greenwashing I've seen globally. Sir Jonathan Porritt's worst nightmare. The Australian Aluminium Council says that the aluminium industry in Australia is not only decarbonising the grid and reducing the content of its CO2 in aluminium, all without doing anything. It's pure green lifting. That is stealing other people's efforts. There are mums and dads forking out hard-earned cash to fit solar to the rooftops, and the smelters are taking credit for reducing emissions while they do nothing. I liken this to your next-door neighbour buying an electric vehicle and you saying you've done something to decarbonise the neighbourhood. You have done nothing. Do not claim you have. You have no social licence for that. The smelters might say they provide some emergency grid relief and frequency response services, but the speed and location of batteries will see all of the frequency response services provided by big batteries in the future, if it hasn't already occurred already. In Germany, I know the smelters had that market completely tied up, and batteries from outside Germany as well took that market away from them. And batteries are so fast that they can't be competed with. In regard to emergency response, South Australia and Victoria already at the end of winter are now on high alert this year that there will be power cuts this summer. And I can't fathom why smelters want to risk potline outages when fitting modulation technology could mean controlled modulation downwards. Possibly when the original NPOT's patents run out in a couple of summers' time, the big companies might want to start develop their own. But it's running the risk of being too little too late, because it's not going to take long before the social licence runs out on the smelters and grids like South Australia, New South Wales, and even New Zealand. It's run out in New Zealand, I think. When a portion of the population becomes at risk because they can't get power to their homes in heat waves, because a smelter down the road has hogged it all and has to make metal, then it won't be too long before this wears thin. And as I said, the social licence runs out. And don't shoot me for being the message bearer here. As the IEA wrote in January 23, we must learn to decouple our industrial processes from demand and grid. Not demand the grid supplies at constant cheap power at a fixed price, no matter what the demand. So what could the smelters be doing? Let me give you two examples in the right direction. In November 22, EGA purchased clean energy certificates for 1.1 million megawatt hours of electricity. The certificates track the use of solar power from one of the world's largest single-site solar plants. And the purchase will cover about 80,000 metric tonnes of low-carbon aluminium. EGA notes that production of solar-powered aluminium is contingent on the amount of solar power it derives from the power grid. In other words, it's not firm supply. Rather, they can use their own gas to do the firming. While noting here that EGA says in their media release that essentially BMW accelerated their progress in sustainability. Pushed them, in other words, so thumbs up for BMW as well. And because they're also using remelt, they're getting down to less than 4 tonnes of CO2 per tonne. Again, good job. Not only are they going down the pathway, but they're forging a route others can follow. And I know they're still burning gas, but it's still taking a chunk out of emissions now and lessening the future job in the future. And that is what we need. And as solar concentrator technology comes mainstream, that is using solar to superheat water so they can drive steam turbines for many, many more hours of the day than the sun shines, they should be able to power the smelter with more and more power, and possibly in the future even a 24/7 option from solar power. Now I have to say here, a few years ago, I got into an argument on an ASI meeting with one of the senior executives from Greener Aluminium. And I said to them they could be doing this. This is back then, probably in about 2020. I said exactly what EGA are doing. I said they could do. And he said it was not possible because his main objection was, where would they put all the solar panels? This is in the Middle East. But EGA has just proved the ridiculousness of his argument. So yeah, more good news. Vedanta Aluminium has produced, it says it's signed a long-term power delivery agreement in the order of 1,335 megawatts, I think, of renewable energy to power its operation. They will use a mix of both solar and wind, cutting emissions by around 3.2 million tonnes of CO2 a year. Well done. Great start. Keep going. Vedanta also say that on top of that, they've successfully conserved 1.3 million gigajoules of energy in the past financial year. And it's also commissioned the country's largest fleet of lithium-ion battery-powered EV forklifts. This is real progress. They have actually addressed the three pillars of the energy transition: conservation, fossil fuel replacement, and renewable energy PPAs. Awesome work, Vedanta. Keep going. What else could we be doing? Well, number one is signing PPAs for whatever renewable energy we can contract, and looking to install modulation technology so we can provide energy use flexibility. Two, we talk about, and by the way, taking what you can get tomorrow is better than delaying. Those with hydropower can also be building wind and solar to supplement the hydro, essentially using hydro as a battery. I think Lochaber in Scotland proposed this a few years ago, and it's a great idea. They were going to build some wind. Build your own renewables. When 40% of your cost of electricity is electricity, you should be investing in your own generation. We also need to be collaborating, sharing research, both successes and dead ends. And I say this because we don't have time to wrap up a patent for 20 years. You know, we've only got 27 years to 2050. And so locking up a piece of technology that could help the industry decarbonise is, there's no social licence for that. Forget about that sort of old mentality. We need to be forging partnerships, collaborations. We need to be sharing research across the industry. Interestingly, I know I've been involved in steel production recently, and I know the steel industry is moving fast towards that and sharing research because they know the whole industry has got to decarbonise. Last words. And the world doesn't owe us a favour, especially if you're a producer of CO2 who makes aluminium as a byproduct. Thank you to those out there who are every day trying to make a difference. Kia kaha. Thank you very much.